Kayla, Big Shaq's daughter, was just walking home after her swimming class, the sun still glistening off her wet hair. As she strolled down the sidewalk, a police car pulled up beside her. The officer, eyes narrowed, didn't see a young girl on her way home. He saw a target. He immediately questioned her, his words dripping with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Kayla, confused, tried to explain she was just coming home from her lesson, but the cop wasn't listening. Without warning, the officer grabs her arm, dragging her toward his car. Kayla stumbles, scraping her knees, fear in her eyes. But what this officer didn't know was that he had just picked the wrong person to mess with. Because Kayla's father wasn't just any father, he was Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball player, known not only for his power on the court, but for his unbreakable resolve in the face of injustice. This cop was about to learn the hard way that you don't mess with Big Shaq's family. Stick around and hit that like button to see how Big Shaq turns the situation around and how the officer's life would never be the same again. The neighborhood was calm, almost idyllic, with tree-lined streets and the occasional friendly wave from a neighbor. Kayla had just stepped out of the community swimming center, her hair still damp and her cheeks flushed from an intense session in the pool. She loved this time of day. The walk home gave her a chance to decompress, to feel the warm sun on her skin and the cool breeze against her face. With her backpack slung over one shoulder and her swim gear in hand, she hummed a tune softly under her breath, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement. She is only a few blocks from home, already imagining the warm embrace of her dad and the stories she'd share about her swim lesson. To her, it was just another normal day. But normality has a way of shifting in an instant. The hum of an approaching car barely registered until it slowed down, the sound of tires crunching softly against the asphalt. A white police car rolled up beside her, its presence unremarkable at first. After all, she had nothing to fear. The passenger window lowered with a mechanical whir, and a uniformed officer leaned out slightly, his sunglasses catching the glint of the sun. "Excuse me, young lady," he called out, his tone neutral but with an edge that Kayla couldn't quite place. She paused, her polite nature compelling her to turn toward him. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady though her heart picked up just a beat. The officer scanned her from head to toe, his gaze lingering as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone still measured but now tinged with suspicion. Kayla tilted her head slightly, puzzled. "I'm just walking home, sir. I live a few blocks away," she explained, gesturing down the street. The officer didn't seem convinced. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a weight that seemed to echo in the quiet street. As he approached, the tension became palpable. Kayla instinctively took a step back, her calm demeanor faltering under his intense scrutiny. "You live around here?" He pressed, his tone growing sharper. "Do you have any ID to prove that?" Kayla hesitated, her hands fumbling nervously with the strap of her backpack. I I don't carry ID. I'm just coming back from swimming class." The officer's expression hardened. "Is that so? You sure you're not wandering where you're not supposed to be?" The question hit her like a cold slap, confusion giving way to a creeping sense of fear. "No, sir," she said, her voice smaller now. I live here. I'm not doing anything wrong." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer crossed his arms, towering over her, his posture shifting from casual to confrontational. "We'll see about that," he muttered, pulling out his radio. Kayla's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, desperate to call her dad. But before she could dial, the officer snatched it from her hands. "You won't be needing this," he said coldly. Kayla gasped, stepping back instinctively. "Why are you doing this? I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice trembled now, tears pooling in her eyes. The officer leaned in, his posture menacing. "You think I'm buying this act? I've seen kids like you sneaking around causing trouble. You don't belong here." Those words hit her like a slap. "Kids like you." The weight of those three words crushed the air around her, making it harder to breathe. That's not true, Kayla whispered, her voice breaking. This is my neighborhood. The officer didn't budge. Instead, he reached for her arm, gripping it tightly. We're going to sort this out at the station, he said coldly, pulling her toward his patrol car. Kayla stumbled as he dragged her forward, the gravel scraping her knees once again. She winced in pain, her voice rising in desperation. Stop! Let me go! Please, I just want to go home! A few bystanders began to gather, their murmurs of confusion and concern filling the air. Hey, what's going on? One man asked hesitantly. But the officer ignored them, tightening his grip on Kayla's arm. Her tears spilled over now, her voice trembling. I'm just a kid. I didn't do anything wrong. Please. She twisted her head, searching the crowd, praying someone would step in. But the fear on their faces mirrored her own. They didn't dare confront the officer. The tension in the air was suffocating, the scene unfolding like a slow-motion nightmare. Kayla's only thought was of her dad. She'd never needed him more than in this moment. Finally, with all her strength, she screamed, Dad! Help! The sound echoed through the street, piercing the growing crowd's silence. Kayla's plea was a cry not just for help, but for justice, for someone to see her, to believe her. The officer jerked her arm roughly. Quiet down! You're only making this worse for yourself, he snapped, his voice devoid of any empathy. But Kayla's scream had done its job. Help was already on its way. And this officer, so sure of his authority, had no idea the storm that was about to descend upon him. Big Shaq's phone buzzed, and the moment he saw the screen, his heart sank. It was Kayla, and from the frantic tone in her voice, he knew something was wrong. He didn't hesitate. Dropping everything, he grabbed his keys and raced to the location she had described. His mind raced faster than his car. What had happened? Who would dare mess with his daughter? As he turned the corner and spotted the scene, his stomach clenched. There she was, his little girl, standing in the street with tears streaming down her face, her knees scraped, and her arms held tightly by a uniformed officer. The crowd that had gathered around was silent, their eyes darting between Kayla and the officer, unsure of what would happen next. Shaq parked his car abruptly, stepping out with a presence that commanded attention. He wasn't yelling, but every step he took was deliberate, his towering frame unmistakable. The crowd parted as he approached, their murmurs growing louder. That's Big Shaq, someone whispered. This is about to get real. Shaq's eyes locked on Kayla, and the sight of her trembling, hurt, and scared made his blood boil. But he didn't let the anger take over. Not yet. This was his moment to take control. He stopped a few feet away from the officer and took a deep breath. His voice, calm but with an edge of steel, broke the tense silence. Officer, he began, his tone low and deliberate. I'm her father. What exactly is the problem here? The officer, visibly startled by Shaq's commanding presence, hesitated for a moment before responding. She was acting suspiciously, he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. I needed to check her ID to confirm she lives here. Shaq's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Kayla, still clutching her scraped knees, and then back at the officer. Suspiciously? My daughter was walking home from swimming class. What part of that sounds suspicious to you? The officer shifted uncomfortably but tried to stand his ground. Sir, I was just doing my job. We have protocols to follow. Shaq took another step forward, his voice rising slightly. Not in anger, but in righteous determination. Protocols? Does your protocol involve grabbing a child, taking her phone and dragging her across the street? Because from where I'm standing, that looks less like doing your job, and more like intimidation. The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Shaq's calm but powerful words. The officer's face reddened as he stammered, I didn't mean any harm. She didn't have ID, and I needed to be sure. Shaq cut him off, his voice now firm and unwavering. She's a child, a scared, innocent child, and instead of protecting her, you chose to humiliate and hurt her. He turned slightly to address the crowd, his voice carrying authority and emotion. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child who's been made to feel unsafe, every parent who's had to explain why the world isn't as kind as it should be. We're better than this. We have to be better than this. The crowd erupted in applause and nods of agreement, their initial hesitation giving way to solidarity. The officer, clearly realizing he was outmatched, loosened his grip on Kayla and took a step back. I I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered, avoiding Shaq's piercing gaze. Shaq bent down to Kayla's level, his voice softening instantly. Are you okay, sweetheart? He asked, brushing her hair gently out of her face. She nodded, her voice shaky. I'm okay now, Dad. Shaq straightened, his eyes locking onto the officer one last time. You owe my daughter an apology, he said, his voice firm but not shouting. A simple command that carried the weight of a demand for justice. I I was wrong, the officer stammered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the onlookers. I shouldn't have treated her that way. I see that now. I'm sorry. Shaq nodded, his expression softening just slightly. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, he said, his tone now less confrontational and more instructive. But it's what you do after that matters. Are you willing to do better? Are you willing to look at every person you encounter, not as a suspect, not as a stereotype, but as a human being, deserving of respect? The officer nodded slowly, his eyes cast downward. I'll do better, he said, the weight of the promise clear in his voice. Shaq turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. We all have a role to play in this, he said. Whether it's calling out injustice when we see it or teaching our kids to love instead of hate, every action matters. Today, this happened to my daughter. Tomorrow, it could happen to yours. So let's make sure we're building a world where no child has to endure what Kayla went through today. The crowd erupted once more, their cheers echoing through the street. People clapped, some hugged, and others simply stood, moved by the raw emotion and truth of Shaq's words. As the officer retreated, humbled and reflective, Shaq knelt down to Kayla's level. You okay, sweetheart? He asked softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. I am now, Dad, she replied, her voice small but steady. And as Shaq rose, wrapping his arm protectively around her, the crowd parted, letting them walk away together. Father and daughter, united by love and strengthened by the stand they had taken against injustice. That day wasn't just about confronting a wrong. It was about reminding everyone there of the power of respect, the importance of humanity, and the courage it takes to fight for what's right. This story goes far beyond Big Shaq and his daughter. It's a powerful reminder that standing up against injustice is not just a choice, it's a responsibility we all share. Moments like these show us the strength and courage, the power in unity, and the importance of speaking out when something is wrong. Silence, after all, only allows prejudice to thrive. But it doesn't have to be this way. Change begins with each of us, calling out discrimination, supporting one another, and standing firm in the face of injustice. What do you think about how Big Shaq stood up for his daughter and delivered such a meaningful lesson? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring content. Together, we can spread awareness and encourage a world where respect and equality are the norm. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.